The ancient prophecy carved into the standing stones spoke of a prison that held back the end of all things, hidden deep within the storm-crest peaks. What the prophecy never mentioned was that the prison's walls were made of human flesh, and the warden had been screaming silently for 537 years. Dorian Ashford stood at the edge of the cursed forest, his weathered hands clutching a leather journal that smelled of pipe smoke and regret. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his mentor Magnus in the cold earth of Winterhold. 3 years since he'd opened the final letter and discovered that everything he believed about courage and sacrifice had been a comfortable lie. The letter had been brief, written in a hand that trembled with either age or shame. "I failed. You must finish. She's waiting." The weight of those 4 words had brought him here, to this gathering of fools and dreamers who called themselves treasure hunters. 127 souls had converged on the makeshift settlement of Ashenvale Camp, drawn by rumors of a crystal that could command storms, grant immortality, reshape the very fabric of weather itself. They set up their tents with the excitement of men who believed fortune smiled upon the bold. They sharpened their swords with the confidence of those who had never truly faced death. They formed alliances with people they would inevitably betray. Dorian had learned at Blackridge 20 years ago that excited men die first. He adjusted the worn strap of his satchel, feeling Magnus's journal press against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Inside those pages lay 3 years of encrypted messages, careful observations, and one terrible truth that would have driven lesser men to madness. The crystal they sought was not a thing. It was a person, and the person was not a treasure to be claimed, but a sacrifice to be honored. The air tasted wrong here. Too sharp, too alive, as if the atmosphere itself had teeth. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon in formations that defied natural law, spiraling inward toward the mountain's peak like predators circling wounded prey. Dorian had spent 3 years learning to read those clouds, learning to see the pain embedded in their patterns. Every spiral was a century of loneliness. Every lightning strike was a moment of desperate hope extinguished. The settlement sprawled before him like a festering wound, a chaotic maze of canvas and ambition. 6 major guilds had claimed territories within the camp, each flying their colors with the territorial aggression of wolves marking boundaries. The Crimson Vanguard occupied the eastern quarter, their blood-red banners snapping in wind that carried the scent of coming violence. The Azure Brotherhood had claimed the Northern Ridge, strategic high ground that spoke of military thinking. The Silver Wolf Company, the Blackstone Legion, the Merchants Alliance, and the Freeblades had divided the remaining space with the careful mathematics of those who understood that position meant survival. And scattered between them, like seeds in poisoned soil, were the independent hunters, men and women who believed their individual cunning outweighed collective strength. Dorian had commanded soldiers at Blackridge. He knew how quickly individual cunning turned to individual corpses when the screaming started. He made his way through the camp with the measured pace of someone who had learned that hurrying attracted attention, and attention attracted questions, and questions led to complications. 3 years of preparation had taught him to become unremarkable, to move through crowds like smoke through a keyhole. The registration tent stood at the camp's heart, a sagging structure of patched canvas that reeked of desperation and cheap wine. Behind a table that had seen better decades sat scribe Aldrich Quill, a man whose bulk suggested he'd grown fat on other people's failures. His ledger lay open before him, its pages thick with names written in black ink. Most of those names had been crossed out in red. Dorian had studied that ledger during his first visit to this place, 3 years ago, when grief was still fresh. He'd counted the dead. 473 names. 473 people who'd walked into the cursed forest believing themselves exceptional. 473 people who'd learned the price of that belief. "Name and specialty," Aldrich said without looking up. His quill hovered over the page like a vulture over carrion. "Dorian Ashford, cartographer." That made Aldrich pause. His beady eyes lifted, taking in Dorian's worn leather armor, the constellation patterns tooled into his bracers, the silver that had begun threading through his dark hair despite his 38 years. Cartographer, not treasure hunter, not mercenary, maps. Maps are their own treasure, Dorian replied. The words felt hollow in his mouth. He'd rehearsed this conversation 100 times during the long journey here, but rehearsal never quite captured the weight of actually standing in this place, breathing this air, taking the first real step toward a choice that could not be unmade. Registration fee is 50 gold. Insurance documentation runs another 100. Next of kin, burial preferences, the usual arrangements. Aldrich's tone suggested he'd delivered these words so many times they'd lost all meaning beyond sound and rhythm. Dorian placed the coins on the table with careful precision. 50 gold pieces that represented 3 years of work, 3 years of mapping trade routes and surveying boundaries for merchants who never looked him in the eye. The work had been beneath his skills, but it had funded this moment. Some prices could only be paid in time and dignity. As Aldrich recorded his name in that terrible ledger, adding him to the list of those who might soon wear red ink like a shroud, a commotion erupted outside. Horns sounded in practiced military precision, 3 long notes that spoke of authority and power. The camp fell silent with the abruptness of held breath. Lord Cassian Valorant arrived like a thunderstorm given human form. He rode at the head of 40 soldiers, men who moved with the synchronized efficiency of those who'd killed together and survived together and learned to trust each other's backs more than they trusted their own eyes. They wore armor that gleamed despite the dust of travel, maintained with the obsessive care of professional warriors. Their tabards bore no noble house crest, just a simple emblem, a broken chain. The mark of the Unchained Legion, bastard sons and cast-off soldiers who'd forged their own brotherhood in the crucible of forgotten wars. Cassian himself was 52 years old, though battle had aged him in ways that transcended mere years. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, the mark of a blade that had come within an inch of ending him. His eyes held the particular weariness of men who'd given orders that resulted in graves, who'd chosen which soldiers died so that others might live, who'd learned that command meant carrying the weight of ghosts. He dismounted with his practiced grace of a man who'd spent more of his life in the saddle than on foot, and his gaze swept across the camp with the assessing eye of someone calculating threats and advantages, measuring strengths and identifying weaknesses. When those eyes found Dorian, they paused. Something flickered in their depths, recognition perhaps, or simple curiosity about a man standing perfectly still while everyone else pressed forward to hear what power had to say. "Good people," Cassian's voice carried across the camp without strain, the product of decades spent making himself heard over the chaos of battlefields. "I bring news that changes everything you believe about this hunt. The crystal you seek is not merely a source of power, it is a lock, and what it holds back is worse than anything your nightmares have conjured." Silence crashed down like a falling anvil. The crowd that had been jostling for position went still, each person suddenly aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeat, their own mortality. The coalition of 5 archmages did not create the curse to imprison a rogue sorceress, Cassian continued, and Dorian felt ice crystallize in his chest, because this was information that should have been secret, known only to those who'd read Magnus's journal with cipher and determination. They created it to seal a dimensional breach. On the other side of that breach lies something called the Void Storm entity. It does not kill. It unmakes. It erases existence retroactively, as if you had never been born, as if everyone who remembered you had never been born, as if the very concept of you had never existed. The crowd began to murmur, uncertainty rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. Dorian remained still, his mind racing through implications. How did Cassian know this? Who had told him? And more importantly, what did he plan to do with that knowledge? The woman imprisoned at the heart of this forest, the one they call Seraphine Stormweaver, has been holding back apocalypse for 537 years, every single day. While we lived our comfortable lives, while we loved and lost and grew old and died, and were replaced by children who knew nothing of the debt they owed, she stood watch, alone, suffering, keeping the door closed. Cassian's scarred hand moved to rest on his sword hilt, Not a threat, merely the unconscious gesture of a man who'd learned to find comfort in the familiar weight of steel. And now that door is weakening. The magical lock is failing. We have 7 days before the constellation alignment creates a window of instability. 7 days to find someone worthy to take her place. 7 days to save a world that doesn't even know it's dying. The crowd exploded into chaos. Some began shouting questions. Others started arguing amongst themselves. A few turned to leave with the sudden understanding that they'd signed up for a treasure hunt and found themselves conscripted into the last war they'd ever fight. Dorian watched Cassian's face and saw truth there, but not complete truth. The general was holding something back, some crucial detail that changed the shape of everything he'd said. It was a commander's technique: reveal enough to motivate, conceal enough to maintain control. Dorian had used the same trick at Blackridge, right before he'd ordered 30 men to hold a bridge against 300 so that 5,000 civilians could escape. He'd been 24 years old and already learning that leadership meant being the one who survived to carry the guilt. As the crowd began to disperse, some rushing to fortify their camps, others gathering in conspiratorial clusters, Dorian felt eyes upon him. He turned slowly, his hand moving by instinct toward the knife at his belt, and found himself looking at a woman who carried violence the way other people carried breath. Captain Rena Blackthorne stood 6 feet tall in worn boots, her frame all muscle and scarred leather. She'd lost her left eye at some point in a past she never discussed, and the socket was covered by a black leather patch. Her remaining eye was the color of winter ice and held the same warmth. She studied Dorian with the intensity of someone trying to place a half-remembered face, and when recognition finally dawned, her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, understanding, something that might have been sorrow. "The Ashford boy," she said, and her voice carried the gravel of too many years shouting orders in too many forgotten skirmishes. "Heard your father died. My condolences." Dorian kept his face carefully neutral. Magnus had not been his father, not by blood, but there were bonds that transcended genetics. "Thank you, Captain. I wasn't aware my mentor's passing had been noteworthy enough to reach your ears." Magnus Ashford was noteworthy because he came here 20 years ago and walked away alive. That's noteworthy. Rena moved closer, and Dorian caught the scent of weapon oil and old leather. More than that, he walked away with his mind intact. That's exceptional. Most who survive the forest don't survive what the forest puts in their heads. She gestured toward the mountains with a hand that bore scars across the knuckles, the kind of scarring that came from punching things that punched back harder. "You're here for the crystal like everyone else?" "I'm here to settle a debt." The truth, but not the complete truth. Dorian had become skilled at that particular form of honesty over the past 3 years. Rena's ice-colored eye studied him for a long moment. "Blackridge," she said finally. "I remember now. You were the lieutenant who held the bridge. I was there, 2 ridges over, watching the massacre through a spyglass. Watched you stand in blood up to your ankles, making sure mothers and children got across. Watched you take an arrow through the shoulder and keep standing. Watched you become a man no boy should have to become." The memories rose like bile, the screaming, the way blood made the bridge stones slick enough that soldiers lost their footing and fell into the churning river below. The moment when he'd realized they couldn't hold, the moment when he'd given the order to retreat, and half his men had pretended not to hear because they understood someone had to buy the final minutes with their lives. 30 men held that bridge, Dorian said quietly. 3 walked away. And 5,000 civilians lived to see their grandchildren born. That's the arithmetic of war, boy. The reason commanders drink themselves to sleep and wake up screaming. Rena's expression softened slightly, which somehow made her look more dangerous. "You came back here, to this. After Blackridge, after learning what command costs, you chose to walk into another nightmare. Some debts can only be paid in nightmares, Captain." She studied him for another heartbeat, then nodded slowly. "I saved your life at Blackridge. Put an arrow through a bastard who had you lined up for a killing blow. You never saw it happen. You were too busy holding the line. But I was there." Dorian felt something shift in his chest, a piece of the past clicking into place with the present. Then I owe you more than I can repay. You'll get your chance. Rena turned to leave, then paused. Fair warning, Ashford. I'm here for the crystal same as everyone else. I need the gold it brings. I've got 47 broken soldiers living in a camp outside Winterhold, men and women who gave everything for a kingdom that threw them away once their usefulness expired. I need that gold to buy them land, give them peace in whatever years they have left. So if it comes down to it, if it's between you and that gold, I'll put you down, but I'll hate myself for it. That's the best I can offer. I understand, Captain. That's the arithmetic of war, too. Do what you must. I'll do the same. She left with the measured stride of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when violence became inevitable. Dorian watched her go and felt the first real tremor of doubt since he'd made his decision 3 years ago. Rena was a good woman in a world that punished goodness, doing terrible things for the right reasons. If they ended up as enemies, one of them would die, and the survivor would carry another ghost. He was so tired of ghosts. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the camp in shades of blood and copper. Dorian made his way through the chaos of preparation toward a cluster of standing stones on the camp's eastern edge. The stones predated any map, predated human memory, massive granite pillars carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They'd been here when the first humans discovered this valley. They'd be here long after the last human turned to dust. Magnus's journal had marked these stones with a simple notation. She watches from here, midnight, every night, waiting. 3 years ago, Dorian had come to these stones for the first time, following his mentor's cryptic instructions, half convinced he was chasing the delusions of a dying man's grief-addled mind. He'd waited until midnight with the patience he'd learned in the military, when patience meant the difference between ambush and suicide. And at midnight exactly, as the moon reached its apex, she had appeared. Not dramatically, not with thunder and lightning and the spectacular effects men expected from legendary sorceresses. She'd simply walked out from behind the eastern stone, carrying a wooden bucket in each hand, dressed in the rough spun clothes of a servant, her hood drawn low to hide her face. She'd walked past him without acknowledgement, heading toward the camp's communal well, just another nameless worker drawing water for the morning meal. But Dorian had seen her eyes for just a moment as moonlight caught her face, eyes that held storms, eyes that had watched centuries pass, eyes that recognized him despite never having seen him before. "You have his face," she'd said, her voice like wind through hollow trees. "Magnus's eyes, his way of standing as if waiting for the next catastrophe. But you're not him. I'm his student. He sent me to finish what he started." She'd laughed, and the sound had held no humor, only the bitter arithmetic of hope, disappointed too many times to be trusted. "Magnus couldn't finish it. What makes you think you're different?" "I don't know if I am, but I know why he failed. And that's a start." That conversation had marked the beginning of 3 years spent in the spaces between the camp's chaos and the forest's hunger. 3 years of midnight meetings and philosophical debates, and slowly, carefully, building trust with someone who'd learned that trust was the cruelest weapon ever forged. Now, as darkness gathered and the camp settled into the nervous energy of the first night, Dorian made his way once more to the standing stones. He did not have to wait long. Seraphine emerged from the shadows with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to move between moments, to occupy the spaces people didn't quite look at. Her hood was drawn as always, but he could see the stormlight flickering in the depths where her eyes should be. She set down her buckets with careful precision and stood there, perfectly still, a woman-shaped pause in the flow of time. 3 years, she said finally. 3 years of visits, 3 years of conversations, 3 years of me hoping you'd change your mind, realize this was madness, walk away, and live whatever life you have left to live. And here you are, on the night it all begins. Here I am. Dorian moved closer, careful to maintain the distance they'd established. 3 feet, close enough to talk, far enough to prevent accidental contact. Touch had consequences with Seraphine. Touch meant transformation, connection, the slow erosion of the boundary between human and storm. You read his final journal entries, the ones he wrote as the memory erasure took hold. It wasn't a question. Every word. 23 pages of a man fighting to remember why he felt such crushing guilt, why he woke up with tears on his face, why he looked at storm clouds and felt his heart break without understanding the reason. He knew he'd forgotten something crucial, someone crucial, and it was killing him to exist in the shadow of that absence. Seraphine's hands clenched at her sides, the only visible sign of emotion. I gave him mercy. I let him walk away without the burden of remembering me, without the guilt of choosing his own life over mine. And still it destroyed him. Still he spent 2 decades as a hollow man, shaped by the hole where his memories used to be. He loved you, Dorian said simply. Love doesn't erase just because you command it to. It just becomes a wound that never quite heals, a phantom pain in a limb that was never amputated. That's why I stopped offering memory erasure. Better they hate me for trapping them than live as ghosts in their own lives. She turned to face him fully, and he saw that her face was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight. She was fading, had been fading for decades, the curse consuming her from the inside out. You know what I am, what I really am. Not guardian of a crystal, but the prison itself. My heart was crystallized 537 years ago to create a lock. My body became the door. My mind became the eternal jailer of something that should never have touched reality. The Voidstorm entity, Cassian told everyone today. Her expression flickered with something like surprise. That war criminal knows? How? I don't know. But he's not wrong, is he? About what you're holding back? No, he's not wrong. She moved to sit on one of the fallen stones, her servant's disguise making the gesture seem weary rather than elegant. 800 years ago, my research partner and I discovered a dimensional tear in the fabric of reality. Something was pushing through from the other side, something that existed as the concept of non-existence itself. A paradox given hunger. The coalition wanted to weaponize it, turn it into the ultimate threat. We tried to stop them. They lost control. The thing began unmaking reality in expanding ripples. She looked up at him, and her storm-filled eyes held the weight of centuries. My partner Theron threw himself into the breach as the primary anchor, imprisoned himself in direct contact with the void storm, holding it back through sheer force of will. But one anchor wasn't enough. The pressure would break him within years. So I volunteered to be the secondary lock. They crystallized my heart, bound me to this place, turned me into the reinforcement that keeps Theron's prison stable. And Theron is still there, Dorian said, understanding blooming like frost on glass, still holding the primary prison after 800 years. Every moment is agony for him. Every second is an eternity of the void storm trying to erase him while he refuses to be unmade. He's been begging me to let him die for 6 centuries, but if he breaks, if I weaken and his prison fails, reality unravels. Everything, everyone, gone not just in the present but retroactively, as if we'd never been. The magnitude of it sat between them like a third presence. Dorian had commanded soldiers. He'd made decisions that resulted in deaths. But this was something beyond the arithmetic of warfare. This was the weight of existence itself, resting on 2 people who'd been suffering for longer than most civilizations endured. You've been testing hunters for all these years, Dorian said slowly, pieces clicking together. Not to find someone to free you, to find someone worthy to take your place. Yes. The word fell like a stone into still water. I need a successor, someone who can hold the secondary lock while I finally rest. Someone strong enough to bear centuries of isolation, wise enough to resist the void storm's whispers, selfless enough to choose this burden willingly. Magnus was the closest I've ever found. For 2 years we met like this. 2 years of building trust and something deeper than trust. 2 years of me believing I'd finally found the one. What happened? I gave him the choice. Take my place and let me die in peace, or walk away with memory erasure so he could live without guilt. He stood in my nexus chamber with his hand on my crystallized heart, ready to complete the transfer. And then he looked at me and said, I can't. I'm sorry. I'm not strong enough. Please let me forget." Her voice cracked slightly. "So I did. I let him forget. And he spent the rest of his life knowing he'd failed something crucial without remembering what. That's the price of mercy sometimes. Different torture, same result." Dorian moved closer, reducing the distance between them to 2 feet. Dangerous proximity. "I've read his journals, all of them, including the ones he encrypted, the ones he wrote to you even after his memory was gone, driven by instinct to record feelings he couldn't explain. He never stopped loving you. The erasure took the memories but not the shape they left behind. Every entry is an unconscious love letter to someone he couldn't remember." Seraphine's composure cracked. A single tear traced down her translucent cheek, and where it fell on the stone, frost bloomed in delicate patterns. Don't make this harder than it already is." "It should be hard. That's how we know it matters." Dorian reached into his satchel and pulled out a small box, worn smooth by 3 years of being carried close to his heart. "He left this for you. I found it with the journals. He wrote your name on it, even though he couldn't remember why that name mattered." She took the box with trembling hands. Inside lay a simple silver ring, unadorned, slightly too small for either of Magnus's fingers. A ring sized for a woman who'd been 25 years old 500 years ago. She stared at it for a long moment, then closed the box with careful precision and handed it back. "Keep it. A reminder of what this costs, of what you're choosing." "I know what I'm choosing, Seraphine. I've had 3 years to understand the weight, 3 years to prepare. I'm here to take the curse, to take your place, to give you rest." She looked at him for a long moment, and in her ancient eyes he saw hope warring with desperation, warring with fear. "You have to pass the tests. 3 tests over 7 days. Not because I enjoy tormenting people, but because the curse itself judges worthiness. If you fail any test, the transfer won't take. The curse will reject you. And I'll have to wait another 20 years for the next constellation alignment. Pray I can hold that long, find another candidate, and begin this torture again." "What are the tests?" Test 1, the choice of command. You must prove you can make decisions that sacrifice individuals for collective survival. Magnus passed this one. He had military background like you, understood that sometimes people die so others can live. Test 2, the burden of knowledge. You must walk through the memory grove, experience every death the curse has caused, bear the weight of 500 years of killing. Magnus failed this one. He made it through 50 deaths before the guilt broke him. There are 372 deaths waiting in that grove. And test 3? Her expression became unreadable. Test 3 is called the price of duty. I won't tell you what it entails because knowing would invalidate the test. Magnus never reached it. No one ever has. But if you pass all 3, if the curse accepts you, then we proceed to the Nexus Chamber and complete the transfer. I'll finally be free to die. You'll take my place. And Theron will have a new anchor keeping his prison stable. Dorian absorbed this, turning it over in his mind like a puzzle with pieces made of suffering. How long will I last? If I take the curse, how many years before I break? I don't know. I've held it for 537 years, but I was stronger than you, more experienced with magic, had 2 decades of preparation before the binding. Theron has held his for 800, but he's also deteriorating, calling out to me some days in mindless agony. You're human, untrained in magic, with no preparation beyond these 3 years of conversation. Honestly, she met his eyes. I think you'll hold 50 years, maybe 100 if you're exceptionally resilient. After that, the isolation will break you. The Void Storm's whispers will erode your sanity, and you'll either beg for death or lose yourself entirely. 50 years of suffering to buy the world time to find a better solution. That's a trade worth making. Is it? Her voice held an edge. Is your suffering worth less because it serves a purpose? Does duty erase agony? I've had 5 centuries to consider these questions, Dorian. The answers aren't as clear as you think. Before he could respond, a horn sounded from the camp. 3 short blasts followed by 2 long. An alarm. They both turned to see fire blooming in the camp's southern quarter, green-tinged flames that spread too quickly to be natural. Screams rose like startled birds. "Someone tried to enter the forest early," Seraphine said flatly. "The screaming vines don't appreciate cheaters." They ran together toward the flames, Dorian's military instincts overriding caution. The Crimson Vanguard's section was an inferno, their tents consumed by fire that seemed to burn with malicious intelligence, leaping from canvas to canvas with predatory purpose. People were fleeing in all directions, and in the center of the chaos, Dorian saw a woman collapsed on the ground, her clothes smoking, desperately trying to drag an unconscious child away from the spreading blaze. He moved without thinking, the same instinct that had kept him standing on that blood-soaked bridge at Black Ridge. He sprinted toward the flames, feeling their heat sear his face, hearing Seraphine curse behind him. The woman looked up as he reached her, her face streaked with tears and soot. "My daughter won't wake. The smoke, please." Dorian checked the child's pulse, weak but present. He scooped the girl into his arms and hauled both mother and daughter away from the inferno. Behind him, he heard wind rising, felt sudden cold, witnessed the flames bending backward against their nature as Seraphine subtly wielded power she shouldn't reveal. He set the child down in safer ground and checked her breathing. Not good. Smoke inhalation, possibly fatal. Seraphine appeared beside them, her face pale but determined. She placed one hand on the child's forehead, and silver light pulsed once, twice. The girl coughed violently, her eyes fluttering open, taking in desperate gulps of air. The mother stared at Seraphine with mingled awe and terror. "You're her, the guardian, the storm witch." "You saw nothing," Seraphine said firmly, her storm eyes blazing with intensity that transcended threat and became simple fact. "Your daughter inhaled smoke and coughed it out. Natural recovery. You saw nothing. Understand?" The woman nodded frantically, gathering her daughter and fleeing toward the camp's edge, but others had noticed. Hunters at the fire's perimeter were pointing, whispering, connecting pieces that shouldn't have been connected this early in the game. And stepping out from the smoke, his armor somehow unscathed, came Lord Cassian Valorant. His scarred face held an expression of calculated interest. "Fascinating," he said, his voice carrying despite the continuing chaos. "A servant who commands silver light and bends flames to her will. How unexpected." Seraphine pulled her hood lower, hunching into the servant's posture she'd perfected over decades. "My lord, you're mistaken. I just helped move the child. Please don't insult my intelligence." Cassian moved closer, his hand resting on his sword hilt with casual threat. "I've spent 30 years studying magical theory, trying to find a cure for a curse that's killing my soldiers. I know power when I see it. I know the specific resonance of storm magic. And I know you're exactly what we came here to find." Dorian stepped between them, his body language shifting into the stance he'd learned in the military, the posture that said violence was possible, but not yet inevitable. "She's with me, Lord Valorant, my research assistant, useful for reading old texts and deciphering weather patterns." "A research assistant who glows silver." Cassian's smile held no warmth. "How remarkably convenient." The three of them stood in a tableau, tension hanging like storm pressure before lightning strikes. Around them, the camp continued its chaos, but this moment existed in its own bubble of possibility and threat. Finally, Cassian spoke again, his voice dropping to a register meant only for them. "I'm going to be direct, because I've learned that indirect approaches waste time, and good soldiers die during wasted time. I need curse magic knowledge to save 10,000 men who are dying from a biological weapon our enemies deployed. That weapon is connected to the curse that binds you, created by the same coalition. If I understand your curse, I can create a counter-curse. So here's my offer. Work with me, teach me what I need to know, and I'll ensure both of you survive this hunt with all the gold you can carry. Refuse, and I'll tell everyone in this camp exactly what you are. How long do you think you'll last with 127 hunters competing to claim you?" "You think you're the first to threaten me, General?" Seraphine's voice lost its servant's accent, becoming the ageless tone of something that had watched empires crumble. "I've been propositioned, threatened, hunted, and hated for 5 centuries. What makes you special?" "This." Cassian pulled a black crystal shard from beneath his armor, hanging on a chain around his neck. The moment it came into view, Seraphine gasped, her body going rigid as if struck. "That's impossible," she whispered. "The Coalition destroyed all the focus crystals." "They tried. They missed one. My father's dying gift to his bastard son." Cassian held the shard up, and it pulsed with dark light. "It's carved from the original binding that imprisoned you. It can't control you, but it can hurt you, badly. So I'll ask one more time. Will you help me save my soldiers?" Dorian saw the calculation in Seraphine's eyes, the ancient mind weighing options and consequences. He saw her looking at that shard and understanding that Cassian held leverage, true threat, the capacity to cause suffering that even 500 years of endurance hadn't prepared her for. He also saw her preparing to refuse, to choose defiance over surrender, to accept pain rather than compromise, because that's what 5 centuries of imprisonment taught, how to endure, not how to yield. "Wait," Dorian said quietly. "There's another option." Both Seraphine and Cassian turned to him. He took a breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to propose, understanding that this changed everything. "I know what you are, Seraphine. I know about the Void Storm, about Theron, about the real purpose of the curse. I came here to take your place, to pass your tests, and become the next anchor." He turned to Cassian. "And you need curse knowledge to save your army. So here's what we do. Cassian helps us reach the Nexus Chamber. I complete the transfer, take Seraphine's curse, become the new secondary anchor, and from within the curse prison, I'll use my newfound knowledge to teach you everything you need to cure your soldiers. And if you're lying," Cassian's eyes narrowed, "if the transfer leaves you unable to communicate, then you've lost nothing but time, but I'm offering you the only chance you have. Trying to torture knowledge from Seraphine will fail because the curse itself protects its secrets until the transfer completes. You can't extract what she doesn't have access to give. But once I'm bound, once I'm inside the curse's structure, I'll have access to 5 centuries of accumulated understanding. That's what you need." Cassian studied him for a long moment. "You're volunteering to imprison yourself eternally, to save people you've never met." "I'm volunteering to do my duty. That's what soldiers do." "Soldiers can also be fools." But there was respect in Cassian's voice now, the recognition of one person who understood command meeting another. "You have until moonset tomorrow. Decide if you're actually going through with this madness. If you are, my soldiers and I will escort you to Nexus. If you're not, I'll bind her with this shard and extract what I can." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Ashford, you remind me of my brother. He died 20 years ago on the last hunt, trying to do something noble. I hope you're smarter than he was." He walked away, leaving Dorian and Seraphine standing in the aftermath of flames and revelations. "You shouldn't have done that," Seraphine said quietly. "Shouldn't have told him. Now he'll hold you to it." "I know, but it bought us time, and time is what we need to complete the tests properly." She looked at him with eyes that held storms and centuries, and something that might have been affection tempered by too many disappointments. "The first test begins tomorrow, the choice of command. I hope you're ready to have blood on your hands again, Dorian Ashford, because this time the people who die will die because you chose to let them. I've been ready for 3 years, ever since I read Magnus's journals and understood what duty really costs." They stood together in the darkness as the camp slowly brought the fire under control, as the Crimson Vanguard counted their dead, as 127 hunters began to realize that this was not the treasure hunt they'd imagined. This was war against something that had no form, no mercy, and no interest in anything human beings valued. And Dorian was volunteering to become its prison guard for however long his sanity lasted. 50 years, Seraphine had estimated. Maybe 100, 3 to 5 decades of isolation and suffering and holding back the end of existence. He thought about Magnus, who'd stood at this same threshold and chosen life over duty. He thought about the 30 soldiers who'd died at Blackridge so 5,000 civilians could live. He thought about Cassian's soldiers, dying from a curse that had been created as collateral damage in someone else's war. He thought about the weight of command, the arithmetic of sacrifice, the terrible clarity that came from understanding that your suffering could be measured against billions of lives and found to be an acceptable price. Tomorrow, the first test would begin. Tomorrow, he would prove whether he was strong enough to choose duty over desire, survival of the many over survival of the self. Tonight, he stood under stars that had witnessed 500 years of one woman's sacrifice and knew with absolute certainty that he would not fail where Magnus had failed. He would pass the tests. He would take the curse. He would become the prison that held back the end of all things. And if 50 years of agony was what the world cost, then 50 years was what he would pay. That was the arithmetic of war. That was the weight of command. That was the only choice he had left. Dawn arrived wearing the colors of a fresh bruise, purple and yellow bleeding into gray as if the sky itself had been beaten during the night. Dorian had not slept. He'd spent the dark hours sitting with Magnus's journal open on his lap, reading entries he'd memorized years ago, finding comfort in the familiar cadence of his mentor's handwriting, even as the words described failure and shame and the slow erosion of a man who'd chosen to forget rather than endure. The camp stirred around him with the organized chaos of people preparing for war they didn't fully understand. The Crimson Vanguard had lost 12 soldiers to the Green Fire, their bodies laid out in a neat row that spoke of military discipline even in death. Dorian had walked past them in the pre-dawn darkness, noting the expressions frozen on their faces. Not fear, confusion, as if they'd died trying to understand what was killing them. That was worse somehow. Fear was honest. Confusion meant they'd never even had the chance to be properly afraid. Seraphine appeared as the sun crested the eastern peaks, still wearing her servant's disguise, but moving with less care to hide the fluid grace beneath. She carried 2 wooden cups of something that steamed in the morning cold. "Tea," she said, handing him one, "or what passes for tea in a camp where most supplies come from profiteers and thieves. Drink. The first test requires you to be alert." Dorian accepted the cup and found the liquid within tasted of herbs he couldn't name and heat that had nothing to do with temperature. "Is this magical?" "Everything about me is magical, Dorian. I'm a curse-given flesh, a prison shaped like a woman. Even my breath carries traces of the storm I've been holding back for 5 centuries. She sat beside him on the fallen log that had become his makeshift camp furniture. "But no, the tea isn't enchanted. It's just tea. I've found that small, normal things help maintain sanity when everything else is impossible." They sat in silence for a moment, drinking tea and watching the camp come alive. Soldiers sharpened weapons. Hunters checked supplies. The Merchants' Alliance was already setting up a morning market, selling overpriced goods to people who suddenly understood they might not live long enough to need the coins in their purses. "Tell me about Test 1, Dorian said finally. "You said it's called the choice of command. What exactly does that mean?" Seraphine's storm-filled eyes turned distant, looking at something beyond the present moment. "The curse needs to know you can make decisions that sacrifice individuals for collective survival. It needs to understand that you won't hesitate when the arithmetic of death requires calculation. Magnus passed this test. He'd been a soldier, understood command, had already learned how to carry the weight of necessary deaths." "How does the test work?" "Over the next 2 days, I'll engineer situations where you must choose. Save these people or save those people. Expose my identity to help a few or maintain secrecy to preserve the mission. Let injustice happen for strategic advantage or intervene and risk everything for moral satisfaction." Her voice carried no emotion, as if she'd delivered this explanation too many times to feel anything about it anymore. "The curse will watch. It will measure. And if your choices demonstrate the capacity to bear the burden of existence itself, you pass. And if I fail? Then the curse rejects you, and I wait another 20 years, hoping I don't break before the next constellation alignment." She turned to look at him directly. "Dorian, I want you to understand something before this begins. The test will make you do terrible things. It will force you to become someone you might hate. That's the point." The curse needs to know you can be terrible when necessary, that you won't flinch from cruelty when cruelty serves survival. I've been terrible before. At Blackridge, I ordered 30 men to die. Some of them were boys, barely old enough to shave, who'd joined the military for steady meals and found themselves bleeding out on stone while their lieutenant watched. I've carried that weight for 20 years. I can carry more. Can you? The question held no challenge, only genuine curiosity. Or do you just tell yourself you can, because the alternative is admitting you're not as strong as you need to be? Before Dorian could answer, a commotion erupted near the camp's communal well. Raised voices, the sound of something breaking, and then a scream that cut off abruptly. They both rose and moved toward the disturbance, Dorian's hand instinctively moving to his knife hilt. What they found was carnage. The well stood at this camp's center, used by all 6 guilds and the independent hunters. Someone had discovered that the water had been poisoned. Not with conventional poison, but with something worse, something magical that turned the water black and thick as oil. And everyone who'd drunk from it that morning, everyone who'd filled their canteens for the day ahead, was now collapsing in systematic waves as the curse magic activated. Dorian counted quickly, 32 people down, more falling every minute as the poison spread through systems already taxed by travel and stress. The Crimson Vanguard had been hit hardest, having drawn water first for their morning meal. But members of the Silverwolf Company and several independent hunters were also affected. Captain Renna was shouting orders, trying to organize containment, but organization couldn't fight magic. Dorian saw panic beginning to spread, watched as hunters backed away from the fallen, understanding spreading like ripples in poisoned water that this was no accident, this was attack. He turned to find Seraphine already beside him, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes calculating with the speed of someone who'd seen this pattern before. "You did this," he said quietly. Not an accusation, just recognition. "Test 1, she confirmed. "The curse poisoned the water. I had nothing to do with it directly, but the curse acts on my needs, my requirements. It knows I'm testing you, so it creates scenarios that force choice." "How many will die?" "Without intervention? All 32. The curse magic will consume them from the inside, burning through their life force until nothing remains but empty husks. With intervention, with me revealing my power to heal them, maybe 10 will die before I can reach them all." Dorian felt ice crystallize in his chest as he understood the shape of the choice. If you heal them, you expose yourself. Everyone will know what you are. Cassian will have confirmation. The other hunters will converge. We'll never make it to Nexus in time. Correct. But if you don't heal them, 32 people die. 32 people who came here for gold or glory or desperate need, who don't deserve to be sacrificed for a test they don't even know they're part of. Also correct. Seraphine watched him with ancient eyes. "So what do you choose, Commander? Save the few and risk everything, or let them die and preserve the mission?" The weight of Blackridge pressed down on him, 30 ghosts standing at his shoulder asking if he'd learned anything from their sacrifice. He thought about the bridge, about watching boys bleed out while he calculated how many more minutes they needed to buy, about making the decision to retreat and leave half his command behind, because that was the only way to save the civilians who depended on him making the right choice instead of the good choice. "How long until they're all dead?" he asked. 2 hours, maybe 3 for the strongest. "And if you heal them now, how many survive?" 22. 10 will be too far gone." Dorian closed his eyes and did the arithmetic that would haunt him for however many years he had left. 32 deaths now versus potentially billions later if the mission failed. 10 deaths versus exposing Seraphine and losing any chance of completing the transfer before the constellation alignment ended. The math was clear. The math was always clear. That's why it hurt. "Let them die," he said quietly. The words tasted like ash and old blood. "Maintain your disguise. We proceed as planned." Seraphine studied his face for a long moment. "You understand what you just chose?" "I chose mission over mercy. I chose billions of lives I'll never meet over 32 people I can see dying. I chose to be the kind of person who can make that choice and still function afterward." He opened his eyes and met her storm gaze. That's what you needed to see, isn't it? That I can be the monster the world needs me to be. Not a monster, a guardian. There's a difference, though it doesn't always feel like one. She turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Magnus made the same choice when he took this test. He let 11 people die to preserve his cover. He vomited afterward and wept in private. But he made the choice. That's what I needed to know about him. That's what I need to know about you. She walked away, melting back into the crowd, just another servant shocked by the tragedy unfolding. Dorian stood there and watched people die, watched Captain Rena and the camp healers work frantically to save lives that were already lost, watched the panic spread as hunters realized that this place was actively trying to kill them. And he did nothing. He stood with his hands at his sides and his face carefully neutral and let 32 people burn out from the inside because that was what command required. Because he'd learned at Blackridge that the weight of necessary deaths never got lighter, you just grew stronger from carrying it, and strength built from atrocity was still strength. One of the dying was a young man, maybe 23, with the Silver Wolf Company markings. He reached out toward Dorian as consciousness faded, his eyes pleading for help that wouldn't come. Dorian knelt beside him and took his hand, holding it as the poison finished its work. "I'm sorry," he whispered, knowing the words meant nothing, offering them anyway because that was the least he could do. "I'm sorry you came here. I'm sorry this is how it ends. I'm sorry I'm choosing to let you die." The young man's grip weakened, then went slack. His eyes stared at nothing. Dorian gently closed them and moved to the next dying hunter, and the next, and the next. He couldn't save them, but he could bear witness. He could make sure someone remembered their faces, their final moments, their small individual tragedies lost in the larger arithmetic of survival. By the time the last one died, 3 hours had passed and Dorian's hands were shaking. Not from horror, he'd seen worse at Blackridge. From the weight of choice, from understanding that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, from knowing that he'd just proven himself capable of the exact cruelty that the curse required. Captain Rena found him washing blood from his hands at a stream on the camp's edge. She stood there for a long moment, studying him with her ice-colored eye, and he wondered what she saw. A man becoming a monster? A soldier doing his duty? The lieutenant from Blackridge who'd learned the wrong lessons from that bridge? "You could have helped," she said finally. "I saw your face when the poisoning started. You understood what was happening before the rest of us. You could have warned people, stopped them from drinking. Would it have mattered? Would a warning have saved them, or just caused panic that killed more people in the stampede? Don't play philosopher with me, boy. I watched you let them die. Watched you make a choice. Same choice you made at Blackridge, just slower. Sacrifice the few for the many." She moved closer. "I respect that choice. I've made it myself more times than I can count. But I need to know, are you making it because it's necessary, or because you've convinced yourself that being ruthless means being strong?" Dorian met her gaze. "Does it matter? Dead is dead regardless of my motivation. It matters because ruthless commanders who think they're being strong tend to start seeing everything as acceptable collateral. They stop counting the cost because counting hurts, and when you stop counting, you stop being a guardian and start being the threat you're supposed to protect against." "I counted," Dorian said quietly. 32 dead. 10 could have been saved if I'd made a different choice. I counted all of them. I held their hands while they died. I'll remember their faces when I'm imprisoned in that curse for the next 50 years. I counted, Captain. I'm still counting. Rena studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. Good. Keep counting. The moment you stop is the moment you become something that needs to be put down. She turned to leave, then paused. The Crimson Vanguard is talking about leaving. They've lost 23 people in 2 days. Morale is breaking. If they leave, others will follow. Might be just you, me, and Cassian's soldiers left by tomorrow. Would that be worse? Fewer people means fewer variables, less chance of someone interfering with the mission. It also means less chance of anyone surviving if things go wrong. Numbers matter in war, even when the war is against something that doesn't fight like soldiers. She walked away, leaving Dorian alone with his blood-cleaned hands and his growing collection of ghosts. The afternoon brought the second situation, and this one came wrapped in the particular ugliness of human cruelty rather than magical misfortune. Dorian was reviewing Magnus's maps when he heard the argument. Loud voices near the Silverwolf Company's section, the particular tone that preceded violence. He arrived to find a crowd gathered in a loose circle, that special configuration people formed when they wanted to watch something terrible without technically participating. In the circle's center stood two men. One was a Silverwolf lieutenant, his armor marked with kill tallies that spoke of experience and brutality in equal measure. The other was an independent hunter, older, wearing the simple leather of someone who couldn't afford better. Between them lay a torn satchel and scattered supplies. "Thief," the lieutenant was saying, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "Caught him stealing from our stores. Water, dried meat, medicine, 30 gold worth of supplies." "I wasn't stealing," the older hunter protested, his face pale with fear. "I was trying to buy them. I have gold. I just needed to negotiate first." "Found you with your hands in our supplies. That's stealing, and we hang thieves." The lieutenant gestured to two of his companions who moved forward with rope, their intentions clear. The crowd murmured, but no one moved to intervene. This was camp justice, the kind that happened when civilization's rules didn't reach, and people made their own order from violence and fear. Dorian had seen it before in military camps, the way isolated communities turned savage when they thought no one was watching. He was about to turn away. This wasn't his business, and he had larger concerns than one man's life weighed against camp politics when he saw something that changed the equation. The older hunter had a daughter. She stood at the crowd's edge, maybe 16 years old, watching her father about to be executed for a crime he might not have committed. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and her face held the particular expression of someone watching their world end. Dorian thought about the bridge at Blackridge, about civilian families he'd saved, about the reason he'd ordered 30 men to die in the first place. He thought about Test 1, about choices and arithmetic and the curse measuring his capacity for necessary cruelty. He thought about the fact that intervening would expose him to attention, might complicate relationships with the Silverwolf Company, could create ripples that affected the mission's success. And then he stepped into the circle. "Wait," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority he'd learned as a young lieutenant who needed older soldiers to obey. "I'll pay his debt. 30 gold for the supplies plus 10 gold penalty. Release him." The Silverwolf lieutenant turned to regard him with barely concealed contempt. "This doesn't concern you, cartographer. This is company business." "I'm making it my business. Here's your gold." Dorian counted out 40 coins, each one representing work and sacrifice and choices made long before he came to this cursed place. "Take it and let him go. And what's to stop every thief in camp from stealing, knowing you'll pay their debts?" "Common sense. I'm not a rich man. I can't afford to buy many pardons. But I can afford this one. So take the gold or refuse it, but decide quickly because I have actual work to do." The lieutenant considered for a long moment, weighing pride against profit, then snatched the coins. "Fine, but if I catch him near our supplies again, no amount of gold saves him." He shoved the older hunter toward Dorian and walked away, his companions following with the disappointed air of men denied entertainment. The crowd dispersed, the spectacle over. The older hunter stood there trembling, his daughter running to embrace him, both of them crying with relief and residual terror. "Thank you," the hunter managed. "I don't know how I'll repay you, but I swear on my life I will." "Don't worry about repayment. Just try to stay away from situations that end with you in front of angry men with rope." Dorian turned to leave, wanting to escape before gratitude became obligation. "Wait," the daughter's voice stopped him. "Why did you help? No one else was going to. They were just going to watch him die." Dorian looked at her and saw himself at 16, watching Magnus return from some dangerous expedition, feeling the overwhelming relief of not being orphaned yet. Because someone has to be the person who intervenes, otherwise we're all just watching each other die and calling it justice. He walked away before she could respond, feeling Seraphine's eyes on him from somewhere in the crowd. He'd made a choice, prioritized individual mercy over strategic efficiency, spent resources he might need later. The curse had been watching. The test was ongoing. He didn't know if he'd just passed or failed. That night, Seraphine came to his tent after the camp had settled into the nervous silence of people sleeping with weapons in reach. "You saved him," she said without preamble. "The thief." "He wasn't a thief. He was desperate. There's a difference." "The curse doesn't care about differences. It cares about choices. You let 32 people die this morning. You saved one man tonight. Explain the logic." Dorian had been expecting this question, had spent hours turning it over in his mind. This morning, interfering would have compromised the mission. Tonight, interfering cost me gold, but preserved operational security. The arithmetic was different. Was it? Or did you just need to save someone to feel less like a monster for the choice you made earlier? The words hit harder than they should have because they contained truth. Maybe both. Maybe I'm calculating and guilt-ridden in equal measure. Does the motivation matter if the outcome serves the mission? Seraphine sat down across from him, her storm eyes reflecting the small lamp's light in fractal patterns. Magnus asked me the same question during his test. He'd let 11 die, then saved 3 others from a different situation. He said he was maintaining balance, proving he could make hard choices but hadn't lost his humanity. I told him that humanity and guardianship often conflict, that the curse needs someone who can exist in that conflict without breaking. Did he break? Not during Test 1, but the contradiction wore on him. By Test 2, he was already questioning everything, wondering if becoming the curse's vessel meant becoming the thing he hated most about himself. She leaned forward. "Dorian, I need you to understand something. The curse isn't testing your capacity for cruelty. It's testing your capacity to bear the weight of necessary cruelty without letting it consume you. You have to be able to let people die when death serves survival, but you can't become someone who finds it easy. The moment it becomes easy is the moment you're no longer fit to be a guardian." So I passed Test 1? The first part. Test 1 continues tomorrow with a harder choice. Tonight was measuring whether you could still find ways to preserve your humanity within constraints. Tomorrow measures whether you can choose duty over honor when the two become mutually exclusive. Tell me. Tomorrow you'll discover who poisoned the well, and when you do, you'll have to decide whether to expose them or let them continue operating because their actions serve a larger purpose you can't prevent. Her expression was unreadable. The curse has very little interest in conventional justice, Dorian. It cares about survival. Whatever keeps the prison intact, whatever maintains the lock, that's what matters. Morality is a luxury for people who aren't holding back the end of existence. She left him with that thought, slipping back into the darkness like water returning to a stream. Dorian sat alone with his lamp and his thoughts, and the growing understanding that passing these tests meant becoming something he wasn't sure he wanted to be. But want had never factored into duty. At Blackridge, he hadn't wanted to order those 30 men to die. He'd wanted to find some clever strategy that saved everyone, some brilliant tactical solution that meant no one had to be sacrificed. But war didn't care about want. War gave you impossible choices and measured you by which impossibility you chose to embrace. This was the same, just slower, just with more time to understand exactly what he was becoming. Morning arrived with rumors spreading through the camp like plague. Someone had discovered evidence, tracks leading from the well to the Silverwolf Company's territory, traces of the magical poison in containers hidden in their supply tent. The Silverwolf Company had poisoned the well. They'd murdered 32 people to eliminate competition, to thin the ranks before the real hunt began. Captain Renna organized a confrontation, gathering representatives from each remaining guild. The mood was ugly, the kind of anger that preceded massacres. The Silverwolf lieutenant who'd tried to hang the thief stood at the center of the growing storm, his face pale but defiant. "You have no proof," he was saying. "Anyone could have planted that evidence in our territory." "The magic residue matches," one of the Azure Brotherhood scholars said. "We tested it. Same signature. Your company purchased curse magic from someone before coming here, probably trying to thin competition before entering the forest. Then someone in my company acted without authorization. That doesn't make us all guilty." "Convenient." Captain Rena's voice cut through the argument like a blade. 32 people dead, and you claim ignorance. Tell me, Lieutenant, how many other plans does your company have? How many more of us need to die before you get your crystal? Dorian watched from the crowd's edge, his mind calculating possibilities and consequences. The Silverwolf Company numbered 15 soldiers now, down from their original 30 after the poison had killed some of their own people in a miscalculation of dosing. If the other guilds united against them, it would be a massacre. 15 dead, the camp's numbers reduced to 73 remaining hunters. Or the Silverwolf Company could be driven out, sent away in disgrace, their numbers removed from the hunt, but their lives preserved. Or they could be integrated, their crime acknowledged but overlooked, because every surviving fighter increased the chance of someone reaching Nexus successfully. He saw Seraphine watching him from across the crowd, her servant's disguise in place, but her eyes boring into him with intensity that transcended the distance between them. This was the test, the choice she'd warned about: justice versus pragmatism, honor versus survival. Lord Cassian appeared at the confrontation's edge, his scarred face thoughtful. He caught Dorian's eye and moved to stand beside him. "Ugly situation," Cassian said quietly. "The camp wants blood. They want justice for the 32 dead. They want someone to pay. What do you want, General?" "I want to reach Nexus with enough soldiers to ensure we succeed. The Silverwolf Company are murderers, but they're competent murderers. 15 trained fighters who know how to work together. That's valuable." He paused. "What do you want?" Dorian thought about the 32 dead, about holding their hands as they burned from the inside. He thought about justice and how little it mattered when measured against larger stakes. He thought about the curse watching, measuring, judging whether he understood that guardianship meant swallowing rage and disgust and doing what served survival. "I want them alive and operational," he said finally, the words tasting like poison themselves. "I want them integrated into whatever force moves forward into the forest. I want to use them because using them increases our chances, and our chances matter more than my need to see them punished." Cassian studied him for a long moment. "That's a hard choice to make. A commander's choice, the kind that keeps you awake at night wondering if you're still the person you thought you were." "I stopped being that person at Blackridge." "No, you became a different version of that person. There's a distinction, though it's easy to lose sight of it." Cassian moved toward the confrontation. "I'll handle this. But understand that if I convince them to integrate the Silverwolf Company, you're complicit. Their future crimes, their continued existence, that's partially on you now." "I know. Add it to the list." Dorian watched as Cassian worked the crowd with the skill of someone who'd spent decades managing soldiers and politics in equal measure. He presented arguments about tactical necessity, about survival mathematics, about the difference between justice and revenge. He painted a picture where executing 15 soldiers felt good, but reduced everyone's chances of survival, where swallowing rage and accepting murderers as allies was the harder but smarter choice. It took 2 hours of debate, but eventually the crowd fractured. Some left in disgust, unable to stomach the compromise. Others accepted the logic, understanding that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. The Silverwolf Company would be integrated into a larger force under Cassian's direct command, their autonomy removed, but their lives and skills preserved. Justice deferred for the sake of survival. Dorian found Seraphine that afternoon near the Standing Stones, her usual meeting place. She was sitting on the fallen log with her hands folded in her lap, looking more tired than he'd ever seen her. "Test 1 is complete," she said as he approached. "You passed. The curse has measured your capacity for necessary cruelty and found it sufficient. I let 32 people die and protected their murderers. That's what sufficient looks like? That's what guardianship looks like. The curse doesn't care about justice or morality or the weight on your conscience. It cares about whether you can make decisions that serve survival, even when those decisions destroy the person you want to be." She looked up at him. Magnus passed Test 1. He made similar choices, carried similar weight. But Test 1 was never what broke him. Test 2 was. The burden of knowledge, walking through the memory grove, experiencing every death the curse has caused. 372 deaths. Magnus made it through 50 before his guilt shattered him. The curse needs to know you can bear not just the weight of your own choices, but the accumulated weight of 500 years of killing. Every person the curse has taken, every life ended by the forest's defenses, you'll experience their death from their perspective. You'll feel what they felt, know what they knew, carry what they carried. Dorian absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. When does Test 2 begin? Tomorrow. We enter the forest proper, move toward the inner defenses. The memory grove lies 3 days' journey in, past the initial barriers. Cassian's force will escort us. The remaining hunters will follow in groups. Not everyone will survive the journey. The forest doesn't tolerate crowds. How many do you think will make it to the grove? Honestly, maybe 40? The forest has been evolving, growing more lethal with each hunt. It feeds on the desperation of those who enter, turns their fear into weapons against them. She stood. Dorian, before we begin Test 2, I need to tell you something about Magnus that his journals didn't mention because he wrote them after the memory erasure. What is it? He loved me. Genuinely. Deeply. In the way that transcends convenience or attraction and becomes something fundamental. And I loved him back. For 2 years we met like this, talked like this, built something that felt like it might redeem 5 centuries of loneliness. When he reached the memory grove and began experiencing those deaths, it wasn't just guilt that broke him. It was the understanding that if he took my place, if he became the curse, we'd be separated forever. He'd be imprisoned, I'd be free but mortal and eventually dead, and the 2 years we'd had would be all we'd ever have. He chose love over duty. He chose love over eternal imprisonment, while the woman he loved died of old age, knowing he was suffering because of her. That's a more complicated choice than simple duty versus desire. Her storm eyes held depths of pain that 5 centuries hadn't dulled. I tell you this because you need to understand what's waiting for you. The curse doesn't just test whether you can bear death. It tests whether you can bear death while knowing that everything you sacrifice is for people who will forget you, who will live and love and die while you exist in frozen isolation. It tests whether duty is stronger than the very human need to be remembered, to matter, to have your suffering mean something to someone. Dorian thought about this, about what she was really saying. You're telling me that part of Test 2 is measuring whether I can walk away from you, whether I can condemn myself to eternity, knowing you'll be free, but we'll be separated. Yes, because if you can't, if your feelings for me become a chain that keeps you from accepting the full weight of the curse, then you'll fail just like Magnus did. The curse needs someone who can love and lose and still function. Someone who can carry the weight of caring while accepting that care can't change the terrible mathematics of what must be done. Do you want me to fail? The question emerged before he could stop it. Is that why you're telling me this? Because you hope I'll choose the same way Magnus did? Seraphine was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what I want anymore. I've wanted to die for 3 centuries. I've wanted to be free for 5 centuries. I've wanted someone to understand what I've endured for longer than I can measure. And for 2 years, Magnus understood. And for 3 years, you've understood. And now I'm about to test whether your understanding translates to strength, or whether it becomes the weakness that prevents you from saving everyone. That's not an answer. No, it's not, because I don't have one. Ask me again after Test 2, after you've walked through the grove and felt what I've carried, after you understand exactly what you're volunteering to become. Then maybe I'll know whether I want you to succeed or fail. She left him with that ambiguity, disappearing into the camp's evening chaos. Dorian sat alone with the weight of everything he'd learned, everything he'd chosen, everything he was choosing to become. Test 1 complete. 32 dead, 15 murderers preserved, his soul bearing weight that would never quite dissipate. And that was just the beginning. Test 2 awaited. 372 deaths. 372 perspectives on what it meant to die because of a curse that existed to save the world. 372 people who'd walked into this forest seeking treasure or glory or escape and found only the final understanding that their lives were considered acceptable collateral in a war they'd never known they were part of. Magnus had broken after 50 deaths. Dorian needed to survive all 372. And then, if he passed, Test 3 waited. The test Seraphine wouldn't describe. The test no one had ever passed. The final measurement of whether he was truly capable of becoming what the world needed him to be. He thought about the bridge at Blackridge one more time. Thought about the moment when he'd given the order to retreat. When he'd looked into the eyes of soldiers who understood they'd been chosen to die. When he'd learned that command meant being the person who survived, to remember those who didn't. He'd survived Blackridge and spent 20 years carrying the weight. Tomorrow he walked into the forest, into the memory grove, into 372 deaths that would teach him exactly what burden he was volunteering to carry for the next 50 years. If he survived the knowing, if the knowledge didn't break him the way it had broken Magnus, if duty proved stronger than love, stronger than rage, stronger than the very human desire to refuse burdens that exceeded what any single person should be asked to bear. The night settled over the camp like a shroud. Tomorrow the real test began. Tomorrow he would learn whether he was strong enough to bear the weight of centuries, or whether he was just another name that would be crossed out in red ink in Scribe Aldrich Quill's ledger of failures. The forest swallowed them on the third morning after Test 1's completion, and Dorian understood immediately why 473 names had been crossed out in red ink. The trees here didn't follow natural law. They grew in spirals that defied geometry, their bark textured like scales, their branches reaching downward as if trying to claw their way into earth instead of climbing toward sky. The air tasted of ozone and old magic, each breath carrying the weight of centuries compressed into seconds. 53 hunters had entered the forest. Cassian's 40 soldiers moved with military precision, their formation tight and disciplined. Captain Renna led a group of 12 veterans who'd survived enough campaigns to recognize death's scent. The Silver Wolf Company's remaining 15 moved separately, still integrated but isolated by the camp's lingering disgust. And scattered among them were individuals who'd chosen to venture alone, believing their singular cunning outweighed collective strength. Dorian walked near the formation's center, close to where Seraphine moved in her servant's disguise. She'd been quiet since they'd entered, her storm-filled eyes tracking movements in the canopy that no one else could see. The curse recognized its own territory. She was home, returning to the prison that had shaped 5 centuries of existence. The first death came within 3 hours. One of the independent hunters, a man who'd bragged the previous night about his 14 successful expeditions into cursed territories, stepped off the path to examine what looked like a silver flower growing from a lightning-struck tree. The moment his fingers touched the petals, the flower exploded into crystalline shards that embedded themselves in his flesh. He had time to scream once before his entire body began crystallizing from the point of contact outward, skin becoming translucent glass, blood freezing into ruby structures visible through his chest. It took 47 seconds for the transformation to complete. They timed it because watching was all they could do. When it finished, he stood there as a perfect glass statue, his face frozen in an expression of horrified understanding, beautiful and terrible and completely dead. "Don't touch anything," Cassian ordered, his voice carrying the flat affect of a commander who'd learned not to waste emotion on deaths that couldn't be prevented. "Don't leave the path. Don't investigate anything unusual." They moved on, leaving the glass corpse behind. Dorian glanced at Seraphine and saw something like sorrow cross her translucent features. "The forest has been learning from deaths for 5 centuries," she said quietly. "Every plant here has adapted to consume life, and all of it feeds the curse, strengthens the prison, keeps the void storm locked behind layers of accumulated mortality." The second death came that evening when they made camp. One of Cassian's soldiers volunteered for first watch. They found him 3 hours later hanging from a tree, suspended by vines that had grown through his body, entering through his mouth and emerging from his chest and back like grotesque embroidery. His eyes were still open, still aware. The vines hadn't killed him, just paralyzed and slowly drained him. Cassian ordered him cut down and mercy given. A quick knife to the throat, death delivered by a commander who understood that sometimes leadership meant ending suffering you couldn't prevent. The young soldier died with gratitude in his fading eyes. They burned the body rather than leave it for the forest. The flames were green-tinged, the smoke smelling of copper and regret. "Hollow threads," Seraphine explained as they watched the pyre. "They drain experiences, absorb lifetimes, feed those memories to the curse. The forest has been educated by murder for 500 years. It knows every strategy, every trick, every hope people bring, and it turns that knowledge into better methods of killing." The third death was almost artistic in its cruelty. A Silver Wolf Company soldier found a pool of water so clear it looked like liquid diamond. He knelt to drink. His reflection climbed out of the pool, a perfect duplicate made of animated water, and drowned him in air, forcing liquid down his throat and nose and lungs until he died on dry ground. The water duplicate collapsed back into the pool, leaving a corpse that leaked water instead of blood. By the time they reached the memory grove 3 days later, they'd lost 17 people, 17 different deaths, 17 new lessons for the forest, 17 additions to the collection waiting ahead. The grove itself was beautiful in the way that execution chambers could be beautiful when designed by artists. The trees grew straight and tall, their bark smooth as polished stone. Between them stretched walls of ice that reached toward the sky, each surface covered in images like photographs captured in frozen water. Thousands of images, tens of thousands. Every death the curse had caused over 5 centuries, preserved in perfect detail. "This is where Test 2 occurs," Seraphine said, and her voice held reverence mixed with horror. 372 deaths are marked for you. Touch each image and you experience that death from the victim's perspective, not just seeing it, but becoming it. You feel what they felt, think what they thought, die as they died. She gestured to the ice walls stretching in all directions. Magnus made it through 50 before his guilt shattered him. You must survive all 372. Cassian's soldiers had stopped at the grove's edge, unwilling to enter. Captain Renna stood with them, her ice-colored eye studying the walls. "How long does it take?" Dorian asked. "Time moves differently inside. For you, weeks of subjective experience. Out here, only hours will pass." Seraphine's expression became distant. The curse compresses experience, forces learning into accelerated time frames. Your mind will experience every moment in full, while your body remains here, unchanging. Before he could respond, she touched his shoulder. The first physical contact they'd shared since their relationship began 3 years ago. Lightning danced across his skin as her power flowed into him like ice water in his veins. "A fragment of my awareness," she said. "When the deaths become overwhelming, when you feel yourself drowning in other people's endings, follow this thread back. It will remind you who you are." The lightning settled into his bones, becoming part of him. He could feel her presence now, a cool certainty beneath his thoughts. "Enter the grove," she said. "Touch the marked deaths. Learn what the curse needs you to know. And when you've experienced all 372 lessons, come back." Dorian walked into the grove, his footsteps crunching on frost that shouldn't exist. The temperature dropped with each step, the air becoming thin and sharp, each breath visible as vapor that dissipated like dying ghosts. The first marked death glowed with silver light. The ice showed a woman, perhaps 30 years old, reaching toward a flower identical to the one that had killed the hunter on their first day. Dorian touched the ice. Reality dissolved. He became her, felt her curiosity, her belief that such beauty couldn't harbor danger, felt his fingers touch the petals, felt the explosion of crystalline shards embedding in flesh, felt the crystallization beginning, skin becoming glass, blood freezing into ruby structures, felt consciousness trapped in a crystallizing brain, thoughts slowing as neurons became crystal, the final horrified understanding that death would be slow and aware, and there was nothing to do but experience every second of transformation. The death lasted 47 seconds. It felt like 47 years. Dorian returned to himself gasping, his hands pressed against the ice wall. The fragment of Seraphine's awareness pulsed gently, reminding him who he was. 371 to go. The second death was the young soldier taken by hollow threads. Dorian experienced the vines growing through him, threading his body like needles through cloth. Experienced the paralysis, the inability to scream or fight. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the awareness that this would take hours, that he'd remain conscious through all of it, that mercy would only come when someone found him and decided death was preferable to this half-life. He experienced Cassian's knife across his throat with gratitude so profound it made him weep. The third death, the fourth, the 10th, the 20th. A man suffocated by moss that grew over his face in seconds, inhaling spores that made his lungs blossom with fungal growth from the inside. A woman pulled underground by roots, buried alive while still conscious, earth filling her mouth and nose and eyes. A hunter who found a bird's nest and reached for the eggs, only to have the mother bird reveal itself as something with too many wings and a beak that could penetrate skull. Death after death after death, each one unique, each one terrible, each one teaching what it meant to exist in a place designed to prevent people from reaching the center. Dorian lost count somewhere around death 60, the one that broke Magnus. He understood why. 60 deaths meant 60 different experiences of ending, 60 different perspectives on final moments, 60 sets of final thoughts that mostly centered on regret and love and desperate wishes for one more chance. The weight was crushing. The fragment of Seraphine's awareness pulsed stronger, pulling him back from drowning in other people's mortality. He remembered who he was, why he was here, what he'd chosen to become. He touched the 61st death, 70 deaths, 80, 90. Somewhere around 100, Dorian stopped trying to separate his identity from the deaths he experienced. It was easier to let himself dissolve into the flood, to become each person fully rather than fighting to maintain boundaries. He died 100 different deaths, felt 100 different final moments, carried 100 different loads of regret and unfinished business, and kept walking. 150 deaths, 200. A pattern emerged. The curse hadn't selected these deaths randomly. They were arranged to show progression, to demonstrate how the forest had evolved over centuries. The early deaths were simple: poison flowers, strangling vines, enhanced predators, deaths that would fit in any hostile wilderness. But the later deaths showed evolution. The mirror pool, the moss that made lungs bloom with fungal gardens, the roots that buried people alive with surgical precision. These weren't natural defenses. These were specifically designed execution methods created by a curse that had learned from centuries of killing. 250 deaths. Dorian collapsed to his knees in the frozen grove, his mind fracturing under the weight. The fragment of Seraphine's awareness burned bright, a lighthouse in storm, pulling him back. He was Dorian Ashford, 38 years old, had commanded soldiers, had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. He was not these deaths. He was the witness. He was the person who would carry their weight so that others wouldn't have to. He stood, touched the 251st death. The deaths began to change character, around 300. These weren't random hunters. These were people who'd gotten close to the Nexus Chamber, people who'd understood too much. Death, 307, was a woman who'd discovered the truth about the Void Storm. The forest had killed her through overwhelming force, crushing her under concentrated assault that left nothing but paste and broken dreams. Death, 319, was a man who'd brought tools to break curse magic. The curse had waited until he reached the Nexus entrance, let him begin his work, then collapsed the forest on him. These deaths weren't just protection, they were warnings. Messages written in mortality that said attempting to break the curse brought consequences worse than simple death. 350 deaths. Dorian could barely stand. The weight of 350 different endings pressed down with force that felt like multiplied gravity. Each death was a stone added to a load he was carrying on his soul. But he kept walking, kept touching ice walls, kept experiencing the deaths the curse had selected as his education. Because stopping meant failing. And failing meant Seraphine would wait another 20 years, hoping she could endure, hoping the curse wouldn't break and release the void storm to unmake existence. 360 deaths, 12 more, just 12 more experiences, and Test 2 would be complete. Death 361 was different. Not dying, but prolonged imprisonment. Someone the curse had captured alive, suspended in awareness while the forest slowly drained them over weeks. Dorian felt every hour of slow death, every moment of hope followed by crushing understanding that rescue wasn't coming, every second of watching his body deteriorate while consciousness remained trapped. When it finally ended after 37 days of dying, Dorian emerged screaming, his voice raw. The fragment of Seraphine's awareness flooded him with cool certainty, reminding him of purpose and duty. 11 more deaths. The 362nd death was one of the 32 who died from the poisoned well, his choice during Test 1. Dorian experienced the curse magic burning through the victim's system, felt the desperate hope that someone would help, felt that hope die as he watched people pass by, watched a man with storm-filled eyes kneel beside him and offer nothing but witness, felt the final bitter understanding that he was acceptable collateral in calculations he'd never approved. This wasn't just teaching him what it meant to be killed by the curse. This was teaching him what it meant to be the person who chose to let the killing happen. 10 more deaths. 9. 8. Each one worse than the last. These final deaths were people who'd gotten close, who'd almost succeeded, who'd died within sight of their goals. Death 367 was Magnus's expedition partner from 20 years ago. She'd stayed after Magnus left, trying to find another way to help. The curse had transformed her over months into something between human and elemental, trapping her in half-existence. Dorian experienced her decades of suffering compressed into minutes, felt what it meant to lose humanity incrementally, to watch yourself become something else while retaining just enough awareness to understand what you'd lost. 5 more deaths. 4. 3. Death 370 was Magnus himself. The curse had preserved his death, even though it happened outside the forest, because Magnus had carried fragments of it in his blood. Dorian experienced his mentor's death from inside, felt the curse corruption eating Magnus slowly over 2 decades, felt Magnus's guilt at not remembering why he felt guilty, felt his love for someone whose name he couldn't recall, felt his hope that Dorian would succeed, felt Magnus's final moments, lying in bed at 72, thinking of storm clouds and feeling his heart break without understanding why, whispering a name he couldn't remember, dying incomplete. The death lasted minutes. It felt like dying over 20 years. 2 more deaths. Dorian was barely conscious, his mind pushed beyond limits that should have broken him 100 deaths ago. Only the fragment of Seraphine's awareness kept him tethered to sanity. Death 371 was Seraphine's original death. The moment 5 centuries ago when the Coalition had crystallized her heart, when they'd bound her to this place, when they'd ended her life as human and begun her existence as prison. He experienced it from her perspective, felt the betrayal as colleagues revealed themselves as executioners, felt the agony as they forced her heart to crystallize through process that should have killed her, but instead left her aware and suffering, felt the moment when her humanity began fragmenting, when she stopped being Seraphine, who loved and hoped and started becoming Seraphine, who endured and protected and slowly died inside while her outside remained frozen. Felt 537 years compressed into single awareness. Every moment of loneliness, every second of pain, every hour of watching the world change beyond her prison, every person who'd come seeking treasure and found only death, every moment of hoping someone would understand, and through it all, the constant pressure of holding back the void storm. The endless psychic weight of keeping the door closed against something that whispered promises of silence and peace. Dorian emerged from the memory and collapsed, his body hitting frozen ground, his mind scattered across 371 different deaths. The fragment of Seraphine's awareness blazed like sun, pulling his scattered pieces back together, forcing him to remember who he was. One more death. Just one more, and Test 2 would be complete. He crawled to the final ice wall, the 372nd death. He touched the ice and experienced nothing. No vision, no death, no memory, just darkness, and a voice that spoke with the combined resonance of 5 centuries' worth of endings. "You have witnessed 371 deaths," the curse said, its voice a chorus of everyone who died in this forest. "You have carried the weight of knowing what it means to end in all its variations. You have not broken. This is acceptable. This proves capacity to bear burden." "What's the 372nd death?" Dorian managed to ask. "The 372nd death," the curse replied, "is the death you will experience when you finally break. When decades or centuries of imprisonment erode your sanity beyond recovery. When isolation and pressure finally convince you that ending would be preferable to enduring. That death has not happened yet, but it will, and you will experience it from the inside, as yourself, with full awareness. That is the final death the curse teaches, the one you live rather than observe." The darkness released him. Dorian found himself back in the grove, lying on frozen ground, staring up at ice walls covered in thousands of deaths. The sun had moved perhaps 4 hours since he'd entered. For him, it felt like he'd lived multiple lifetimes. Seraphine was kneeling beside him, her hand on his chest, her storm eyes filled with something between pride and sorrow. "You survived," she whispered. "Magnus broke at 50. You survived all 371. I don't feel like I survived. I feel shattered." "You are shattered. The curse broke you into pieces, and you're still trying to fit them back together. But you survived the breaking. That's what matters." She helped him sit up. "Test 2 is complete." Beyond the grove's boundary, Cassian's soldiers waited. Captain Renna stood at the edge, her expression unreadable. "How long was I in there?" Dorian asked. 4 hours. How long for you?" "Weeks. I experienced weeks of dying." He looked at his hands, mildly surprised to find them still solid. "I understand now. The weight doesn't decrease over time. It compounds. Every death adds to the load until existing becomes its own form of dying." "Yes, and you'll carry it for however long your mind endures." She stood, offering him her hand. "One test remains. We reach the Nexus chamber tomorrow. There, you'll face the final choice." Dorian accepted her hand and let her pull him upright. His legs shook. His mind felt disassembled and poorly reassembled. But he was standing. He was functional. He'd survived what broke Magnus. "What is Test 3? "I can't tell you because knowing would invalidate it. But I can tell you that it will require you to choose between 2 things you value equally. The choice will define who you become." Her expression became distant. "Test 3 has stopped every candidate for 5 centuries. It requires something most people can't give. It requires you to choose duty over everything else, even when duty demands you sacrifice the very thing that makes duty meaningful." Cassian approached as they emerged from the grove. "You survived. There's poetry in that." "There's preparation," Dorian corrected. "I had 3 years. Magnus had 2 and was already emotionally compromised." Spoken like a commander. Cassian studied him with weary eyes. "My scouts report the Nexus chamber is 1 day's march ahead. The final stretch is the most dangerous. We've lost another 6 people while you were in the grove. We're down to 37 hunters. By tomorrow, we'll be lucky if 20 survive. Then we move carefully. We move at dawn. Tonight we rest. Tomorrow we either complete this mission or die trying." Cassian walked away to organize camp. "He's right about the danger," Seraphine said quietly. The innermost defenses are things I created in my first century, when rage was stronger than reason. They're designed to make examples. They made camp in a clear space surrounded by trees that appeared dormant, but probably weren't. Fires were lit, guards posted, and people settled into the nervous routine of sleeping, where relaxation meant death. Captain Renna found Dorian as night settled. "You look like a man who's died a few times," she observed. 371 times, technically. She sat beside him. "I lost my eye at Iron Pass. Took an arrow meant for my commander. He died anyway, different arrow. I've spent 30 years wondering if my sacrifice mattered, if it bought anything beyond asymmetrical vision and chronic pain." "Why tell me this?" "Because you're about to sacrifice everything, and I want you to understand that sometimes sacrifice doesn't change outcomes. Sometimes people die for nothing." She turned her ice-colored eye toward him. "But sometimes it does. Sometimes holding the line means civilians escape. You don't know which kind yours will be. You just make it and trust the mathematics will work out." "That's not comforting." "No, but it's true." She stood. "For what it's worth, I think you're insane, but I respect insanity in service of duty." She left. Dorian sat alone with the weight of 371 deaths pressing against his thoughts. Seraphine appeared from the shadows. "Tomorrow," she said simply. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Are you afraid?" "Terrified. But fear doesn't change necessity. If you succeed, if I'm released, I'll have maybe 10 years of mortal life before the curse strain kills me. 10 years of being useless, watching the world from outside rather than as guardian. That terrifies me more than continued imprisonment sometimes. And if I fail test 3, then I hold on for another 20 years and pray I don't break." Her expression became unreadable. "Pray that the world doesn't end because I wasn't strong enough to last, and you weren't strong enough to replace me." They sat together in silence, two people who understood waiting for dawn and the final test. The forest grew denser as they approached the nexus. The trees pressed closer, their twisted branches forming a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. The air became harder to breathe, each inhalation requiring effort, as if the atmosphere itself didn't want them proceeding. They lost 3 more hunters to defenses that struck without warning. Flowers that released spores causing instant petrification. Pools of shadow that weren't shadows at all, but living darkness that consumed anything touching them. Trees whose bark peeled away to reveal mouths lined with teeth made of splinters. By the time they reached the final clearing, only 23 hunters remained from the original 53 who'd entered the forest. 23 survivors bearing the weight of 30 deaths, 30 lessons about what the curse did to those who sought its heart. The Nexus Chamber rose before them like a monument to 5 centuries of imprisonment. Not a building, but a massive tree twisted into an unnatural spiral, its trunk opening into darkness that seemed to pull at the eye, at the mind, at the soul. Around the entrance, the ground was scorched and dead, as if the curse's concentrated power had burned away everything that might grow too close. "This is it," Seraphine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Beyond that entrance lies the chamber where I was bound, where Theron has been imprisoned for 800 years, holding back the Void Storm, where Test 3 awaits." Cassian's soldiers formed a perimeter, weapons drawn, eyes scanning for threats. Captain Renna stood with her remaining veterans, her expression grim. The Silverwolf Company hung back, no longer eager, having learned through 30 deaths what eagerness cost. "What happens now?" Cassian asked. "Now Dorian and I enter alone," Seraphine replied. "The chamber won't permit crowds. It's designed for single-person trials. Anyone else who tries to enter will be killed by defenses I can't control." "And if you don't come out?" "Then the curse continues. I continue, and this was all for nothing." She turned to Dorian. "Are you ready?" He thought about Blackridge, about 371 deaths, about 3 years of preparation leading to this moment, about the choice he'd made to become the person who carried weight so others could live free. "I'm ready." They walked toward the entrance together, leaving the others behind. As they crossed the threshold into darkness, Dorian heard the curse speaking, not with words, but with pressure against his mind, with weight settling onto his shoulders, with the understanding that everything he'd experienced had been preparation for what came next. The darkness swallowed them. The entrance sealed behind them with the finality of a tomb closing, and in the absolute black, Seraphine's storm-filled eyes provided the only light. "Test 3 begins now," she said, "and I'm sorry for what it will require of you." Before Dorian could ask what she meant, the darkness exploded into light, and he found himself standing in a chamber of pure crystal, walls, floor, ceiling, all reflecting infinite versions of himself. At the center stood 3 pedestals arranged in a triangle. On the first pedestal lay Seraphine's original body, sleeping peacefully, looking exactly as she must have looked 5 centuries ago before the curse, young, unmarred, fully human. The second pedestal held her crystallized heart. It pulsed with captured storm, every color and no color, solid and liquid simultaneously, containing power that could reshape weather across continents. The third pedestal was empty, waiting, and suspended in the air above all 3, trapped in a cage of pure magical force, was a man, Theron, the primary anchor, 800 years old, his body gaunt and worn, his eyes holding depths of suffering that made Seraphine's 5 centuries look like brief discomfort. Finally, Theron's voice was barely human, shaped by 8 centuries of isolation into something that resonated with pain. Finally, someone made it through the tests. Seraphine's guardian body flickered, becoming translucent. "Dorian, this is where you choose. This is test 3. "I don't understand." "Look at the pedestals. My original body sleeping, my crystallized heart, the empty pedestal where you would go if you took my place as secondary anchor." Her voice cracked. "Test 3 asks which future you choose." The chamber shifted, and Dorian saw visions layering over reality like translucent paintings. Vision 1. He saw himself refusing the curse, saw Seraphine waiting another 20 years, finding a different successor, saw himself living a full life, growing old naturally, dying peacefully. But he also saw the cost. Theron enduring another 2 decades of agony, the void storm's pressure increasing, the risk of everything failing before the next candidate succeeded. Vision 2. He saw himself taking the curse as planned, becoming the secondary anchor while Theron continued as primary, both imprisoned, both suffering, but together. The burden split. Dorian carrying weight for 50 years or 100 until his mind broke, then hopefully someone else taking his place, an eternal relay of suffering that kept the world safe. Vision 3 showed something different, something impossible. Seraphine standing before her crystallized heart, her guardian body merging with it, using the full power of the curse to attempt something that had never been tried. Not breaking the curse, but transforming it, dispersing it, diluting its concentrated prison into something sustainable. "That's test 3, Seraphine whispered. "Choose which future happens. Choose who suffers. Choose what the world becomes." "Why is this a test? Vision 2 is obviously correct. I take your place. We continue as planned." "Because Vision 2 condemns you to certain suffering and me to uncertain freedom. It's the practical choice, but not the compassionate one. Test 3 measures whether you can choose your own imprisonment, even when an alternative exists." "What alternative? Vision 1 means you suffer longer. Vision 3 looks like suicide." "Vision 3 is suicide," Theron's voice echoed through the chamber. "I've had 800 years to study the curse from inside. If she merges with the heart fully, uses all its power at once, she could theoretically disperse the curse across this entire region. No single person imprisoned, just ambient magic woven into the land itself. But the process would kill her, erase her, and there's only a 60% chance it would work. 40% chance it fails, the void storm escapes, and everything ends." Dorian's mind raced through the mathematics. Vision 2 was certain but cruel. Vision 3 was potentially better but risky and required Seraphine's death. "There's a fourth option," he said slowly. "What if we combine approaches? What if I become secondary anchor as planned, but we use my anchoring to buy time to research Vision 3 properly? Increase that 60% to 90%. Then execute the dispersal with better preparation." "That's not one of the choices," Seraphine said. "Test 3 doesn't offer compromise. It offers 3 paths. Choose one." "Why?" "Because the curse needs to know if you're capable of making absolute choices under pressure. Not clever solutions or tactical flexibility, but the ability to choose when all options are terrible and compromise isn't available." Her storm eyes blazed. "Choose, Dorian. Vision 1, Vision 2, or Vision 3. Who suffers? Who dies? What future do you create?" The weight of 371 deaths pressed down on him, the memory of 32 people dying from poisoned well because he'd chosen mission over mercy. The understanding that duty meant carrying weight that exceeded what any single person should bear. He looked at Seraphine, at 5 centuries of suffering carved into every translucent feature. He looked at Theron, at 8 centuries of agony that had reduced a man to barely human awareness. He looked at the empty pedestal waiting for him. "I choose Vision 2, he said. "I become the secondary anchor. Seraphine goes free. Theron continues as primary. The curse continues in current form because it's the only option that guarantees success." "Even knowing it condemns you to 50 years or more of what you experienced in the memory grove?" Seraphine asked. "Even knowing you'll watch everyone you know age and die while you remain frozen? Even knowing isolation will eventually break you the way it broke Magnus? Even knowing all of that? Because Vision 1 means you suffer another 20 years for uncertain outcome. Vision 3 risks everything on 60% odds. Vision 2 is terrible, but certain." He moved toward the empty pedestal. "That's what command means, choosing the terrible certainty over the comfortable uncertainty." The chamber went silent. The visions faded. The crystal walls stopped reflecting. Theron spoke first, his voice carrying something like respect. "You passed. That was the test. Choosing your own suffering over alternatives that might spare you. Choosing certainty over hope when hope carries too much risk." Seraphine's expression shifted through emotions too complex to name. Relief, sorrow, pride, resignation. "Test 3 complete," she said quietly. "You've proven worthy. You can bear the weight of command, the burden of knowledge, and the price of duty." She moved to stand beside him. "Now we proceed to the transfer. The curse will be yours. I'll finally be free. And you'll learn what 5 centuries of imprisonment feels like, compressed into every moment of however long you last." "Wait," Theron said from his cage. "Before the transfer begins, there's something both of you need to know. Something I've had 800 years to discover." "What is it?" Dorian asked. "The curse can be transformed. Vision 3 isn't suicide if done correctly. I found the formula, the precise method. It requires both anchors working together during the transfer moment when power is flowing between primary and secondary. We redirect that flow, channel it through the heart, disperse the concentrated prison into ambient magic across the entire region. No more single points of failure, no more eternal imprisonment, just distributed responsibility." "You said it was 60% likely to work," Seraphine protested. "I said that to complete the test. The test required you to choose without knowing better option existed. But now that Dorian has proven worthy, now that he's chosen suffering over comfort, I can reveal the truth. I've had 8 centuries to perfect this. It will work, 100% certainty, but it requires both of you willing to sacrifice, both of you pouring everything into the transformation, both of you accepting that the process might kill you, but will definitely free everyone." Dorian looked at Seraphine. "Is he telling the truth?" "I don't know. He could be, or the isolation could have driven him mad, and he genuinely believes something that isn't true." She turned to Theron. "Why didn't you try this before? Why wait for a successor?" "Because it requires secondary anchor's power combined with primary anchor's knowledge. I couldn't do it alone. and none of the previous candidates passed Test 3, so none earned the right to know this option existed. Theron's worn face held desperate hope. "Please, let me give you the formula. Let us try. Worst case, it fails, and Dorian becomes anchor as planned. Best case, we free everyone, and the curse transforms into something sustainable." The chamber waited. The pedestals glowed softly. The crystallized heart pulsed with captured storms. "Dorian," Seraphine said quietly, "this is your choice now, not a test. A real choice. Try Theron's method with unknown risk, or proceed with the transfer we planned." He thought about 371 deaths, about choosing his own imprisonment moments ago because it was the certain path, about the weight of duty and whether duty required suffering when alternatives might exist. "Tell me the formula," he said to Theron. "We try the dispersal. If it fails, we proceed with standard transfer. But if there's a chance to free everyone without eternal imprisonment, we take it." "Even knowing it might kill you?" Seraphine asked. "Even knowing that. Because I didn't choose imprisonment because I wanted to suffer. I chose it because I thought it was the only way to keep everyone safe. If there's a better way, we take it." Theron began speaking, his voice gaining strength as he shared 8 centuries' worth of research compressed into rapid explanation. The formula was complex, requiring precise timing, exact power flow, both anchors working in perfect synchronization. But it was possible. It was real. It could work. "We do this during the transfer," Theron concluded. "As power flows from Seraphine to Dorian, I'll open my prison temporarily. We'll channel combined force through the heart. If we succeed, the curse disperses. If we fail, Dorian anchors, and we're back where we started." "Except if we fail badly, we might release the void storm," Seraphine pointed out. "That's why timing matters. We'll have a 10-second window where all 3 of us are connected, but the prison is still intact. If dispersal fails, we abort and complete standard transfer." Dorian looked at both of them. 5 centuries and 8 centuries of suffering standing before him, offering a chance at freedom that might be real or might be delusion born from isolation. "We try it," he said. "Now, before I can second-guess the decision." They moved into position. Seraphine placed her guardian body on the empty pedestal. Dorian stood before the crystallized heart. Theron began lowering his cage, bringing himself into the configuration. "When I say begin," Theron instructed, Seraphine releases her hold on the curse. Dorian accepts it. Power flows. I open my prison. We channel everything through the heart simultaneously. 10 seconds. If it's working, we'll feel the dispersal beginning. If not, we abort." "And if we can't abort?" Seraphine asked. "Then we die and release the void storm, and everyone learns why we don't attempt untested magical theories under pressure." Theron's expression was grim. "But I've had 8 centuries to calculate. This will work." "Famous last words," Dorian muttered. "Begin," Theron commanded. Seraphine released her hold on the curse. 5 centuries of accumulated power surged toward Dorian like storm given physical form. He felt it entering him, filling him, transforming him from human to prison, from flesh to magical structure designed to hold back apocalypse. The pain was absolute, his cells crystallizing and uncrystallizing simultaneously, his mind expanding to contain 5 centuries of memories, 371 deaths plus thousands more, the weight of existence itself pressing down on his consciousness. Theron opened his prison. 8 centuries of suffering exploded outward, his power adding to the surge. The void storm's pressure suddenly visible, a darkness beyond darkness pressing against the 3-way configuration. "Now!" Theron shouted. "Channel through the heart!" All 3 of them poured power into the crystallized heart simultaneously. The heart blazed with light, with storm, with concentrated magic that represented 500 years of imprisonment given physical form. The dispersal began. Dorian felt the curse unraveling, spreading, diluting across the entire region like ink dropped into vast ocean. The concentrated prison becoming ambient magic woven into land, into trees, into air itself. No single person suffering, just distributed responsibility carried by the earth. It was working. The formula was real. Theron had found the answer. But the void storm sensed the change, sensed the prison weakening, began pushing harder, trying to escape through the gap created by transformation. "Hold!" Theron screamed. 3 more seconds. 2 seconds. 1 second. The dispersal completed. The curse spread across miles of forest, becoming part of the ecosystem rather than concentrated weapon. The prison remained but transformed, sustainable without eternal human sacrifice. And the void storm, finding no gap to exploit, settled back, still contained, still locked behind dimensional barrier. But the lock had changed from 3 suffering people to magic woven into reality itself. The 3 of them collapsed. Dorian's transformation reversed, returning him to flesh. Seraphine's guardian body merged with her original, becoming whole and mortal. Theron's cage dissolved, freeing him for the first time in 8 centuries. For a long moment, none of them moved. The chamber was silent except for their breathing. "Did it work?" Seraphine finally asked. "It worked," Theron confirmed, his voice filled with wonder. "The curse is dispersed. The prison remains but transformed. No more eternal anchors. No more single points of failure. The forest itself maintains the lock now." Dorian sat up slowly, examining his hands. Still flesh, still human. No crystallization, no transformation. "I'm not the anchor?" "None of us are. Not anymore. The anchor is everywhere and nowhere, distributed across this entire region, sustainable indefinitely without human suffering." Theron stood on shaking legs, a man who hadn't walked in 800 years. "We're free, all 3 of us." Seraphine began to cry, 5 centuries of held emotion finally releasing. "I don't understand. How can the prison exist without anchors?" "Because magic doesn't require suffering unless we design it that way," Theron explained. "The Coalition created a system requiring human sacrifice because they thought concentrated power needed concentrated pain. But dispersed power only needs dispersed responsibility. The forest, the land, the ecosystem itself maintains the lock now. No consciousness required, no suffering necessary." "Then why didn't you tell anyone this 800 years ago?" Dorian asked. "Because I only figured it out 300 years ago, and I had no way to communicate with anyone. And I needed secondary anchor's power to make it work, and no one passed the tests until today." Theron moved toward the entrance. "Come, let's leave this place. I've been underground for 8 centuries. I want to see the sun." They emerged from the Nexus chamber into afternoon light. Cassian's soldiers snapped to attention. Captain Rena's eye widened. The remaining hunters stared. "It's done," Seraphine announced. "The curse is transformed. No more hunting, no more deaths. The prison remains, but requires no human anchors." "Then we succeeded?" Cassian asked. "We succeeded," Dorian confirmed. "And no one had to be sacrificed. The void storm remains locked. The world is safe, and we're all free." A cheer rose from the survivors. 23 people who'd walked into the forest expecting death, finding instead that centuries of suffering had finally ended. Theron stood in sunlight for the first time in 800 years, his face tilted toward the sky, tears streaming. "I'd forgotten how warm it feels." Seraphine joined him, her mortal body solid and real for the first time in 5 centuries. "I'd forgotten what hunger feels like, what thirst means, what it's like to exist without the constant weight." Dorian stood apart, processing what had happened. He'd prepared for 50 years of imprisonment, had steeled himself for centuries of isolation, had chosen suffering over comfort because it seemed like the only way, and then they'd found a better answer, had transformed the curse itself rather than merely accepting its terms. Captain Rena approached him. "You look disappointed." "Not disappointed. Confused. I spent 3 years preparing to be the prison, and now I don't have to be." "So you're free to be something else. That's not disappointment, that's opportunity." She gestured to the forest around them. "This place will need guardians, not prisoners, but protectors." People who understand what the curse cost, who remember the 473 who died before we found the answer. Someone has to make sure their sacrifice meant something. Are you volunteering? I'm too old and too tired, but you're 38 with storm magic flowing through you from the aborted transfer. You're marked by the curse, even if you're not bound to it. Maybe that's your purpose, not eternal imprisonment, but eternal vigilance. She walked away, leaving him with that thought. Seraphine found him as the sun began setting. We're leaving tomorrow. Cassian's soldiers will escort everyone out. The Empire will establish a protected zone around the forest to ensure no one accidentally disturbs the dispersed curse. And you? Dorian asked. What will you do with freedom? I don't know. I have maybe 10 years before the curse strain kills me. 10 years to remember what it means to be human. She took his hand. Will you stay with me for whatever time I have left? He looked at their joined hands. No lightning danced between them now. The curse no longer responded to their connection. They were just two people who'd survived something impossible together. Yes, he said. I'll stay. They stood together watching the sun set over the forest that had been prison and was now something else. Something transformed. Something that proved suffering wasn't inevitable. That systems designed around pain could be redesigned around distribution and balance. The weight of 371 deaths would never leave him. The memory of choosing his own imprisonment would remain, but he'd also carry the knowledge that when given the choice between accepting suffering and finding better answers, they'd found the better answer. That was enough. That was everything. The forest whispered around them, no longer hostile, merely watchful. The curse dispersed but present. The prison maintained but transformed. And three people who'd been prepared to sacrifice everything, discovering that sometimes the answer wasn't sacrifice, but innovation. Tomorrow, they would leave this place, would return to a world that didn't know how close it had come to ending, would build lives from the freedom they'd fought for. But tonight, they stood in the forest's heart and understood that duty didn't always require suffering. Sometimes duty required the courage to imagine better solutions, and that was the hardest test of all.